talking about. It's still pretty chaotic. The entire city of Brussels has been completely clogged with these tractors, sort of three abreast in most of the roads across the city. The people of Brussels aren't particularly happy. I mean, this is sort of reminiscent for some people of the Just Stop Oil protests, people gluing themselves. People are unable to get to hospital appointments, and there's a lot of upset about the destruction that's happening on the streets of Brussels today. But on the other side, there's also the protests, which the farmers are saying that EU green laws simply are not able to fit with what they need to do to keep their businesses going. And just before the protests happened, we saw the European Commission actually make some concessions to the farmers' protests. And this is on the demands that were put on them to set aside somewhere in the region of 5% of their land for regrowing for biodiversity. A lot of the farmers have said that's not possible, and the European Commission has said that they can delay that coming in. So they have won a small concession with these protests.
And Jack, there's a feeling as well, a huge dissatisfaction that the European Union has managed to find 50 billion euros in aid to send to Ukraine, and yet farmers in particular are on the receiving end of net zero targets, taxation on diesel and endless red tape. So many farmers, Jack, saying they're measuring ditches to see if they have to drain them or not. There are minimum requirements on the width of battery hen enclosures, endless red tape. As Jeremy Clarkson pointed out in Clarkson's farm in Britain, they've simply had enough, and they're shouting, Ursula von der Leyen, we are here.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good evening. Well, as our future king, Prince William, says the fighting in Gaza should end right now, I ask the question, should he be intervening in this way? We'll talk about the senior official from the Border Force who's now been sacked for revealing that hundreds of flights are coming into the United Kingdom where nobody is being checked at all, yet many are deemed to be high risk. And we'll look at the phenomenon, particularly in the north of England, of young white kids converting to become Muslims, and wonder what that's all about. But before the show, let's get the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Nigel, thank you, and good evening to you. Well, as you've been hearing, the Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration has been sacked today after he was found to have breached the terms of his appointment and lost the confidence of James Cleverly, the Home Secretary. David Neil said he'd received Home Office data showing that the UK Border Force had failed to check the occupants of hundreds of private jets arriving at London City Airport. But the Home Office disputed the claims, with the Minister for Legal Immigration, Tom Pursglove, insisting checks are performed on all scheduled passengers. He said it was deeply disturbing that the independent chief inspector leaked what he described as false information to a newspaper after reports were published in the Daily Mail. The Home Office says it's now investigating the so-called breach. A body was found in the River Thames, which detectives strongly believe, they say, is that of chemical attack suspect Abdul Azidi. Earlier, police say they believed Azidi had gone into the river at Chelsea Bridge. That was based on CCTV evidence. Well, the body was recovered by the Metropolitan Police's Marine Unit at around 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon after a report from the crew of a passing boat. His former partner, who was attacked alongside her 2 young daughters, remains in hospital but is no longer under sedation. Now, Prince William says fighting in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas must end as soon as possible, adding that there is a desperate need for increased humanitarian support to Gaza. The Prince of Wales said he's deeply concerned about what he called the terrible human cost of the conflict, with too many lives lost. It follows Lord Cameron's warning to Israel that the fighting needs to stop, and Labour also calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in a major shift on the party's stance on the war. Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy said earlier the world wants the fighting to stop. Now, Birmingham City Council says it needs a bailout worth £1.25 billion as it looks to recover from effective bankruptcy. Council leaders say a combination of austerity and underfunding has hit the city hard. They're looking at selling assets to cover some of the expenses, but residents are also facing cuts across essential services, including adult social care, highway maintenance and assisted transport. Dimming streetlights is expected to save around £900,000 a year, while cutting refuse collections to every 2 weeks could also save £4 million a year. And lastly, the Prime Minister says a new funding package for farmers will protect the country's food security and ensure fairer pricing for farmers. Addressing the National Farmers Union conference in Birmingham today, Rishi Sunak unveiled new funding to increase productivity and modernise technology such as robotics and solar power. He also pledged to cut red tape, he said, making it easier for farmers to develop new buildings or open farm shops. For the very latest stories, sign up for GB News alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now back to Nigel.
Well, we've been a constitutional monarchy since the late 17th century, and of course part of that deal is that the monarch, or indeed the close immediate royal family, should not interfere with politics that in any way could be seen to affect individual parties. Now, perhaps one of the most classic cases in the 20th century was Edward VIII, who during his brief reign went down to Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales, met thousands of people who'd lost their jobs in the steel industry. In fact, he shook so many hands in the end, he had to change and shake with his left hand, and he said something must be done to get these people jobs. It was taken as a direct assault on the Conservative government of the day. And we could go on to Edward Heath, as many saw it, using the Queen to get us to join the common market, and things the Queen said during the referendum on Scottish separation. And we could, of course, talk about King Charles, who as Prince of Wales endlessly talked about climate change and net zero. But the intervention overnight from Prince William, I think, is the most direct political piece of interference that has international and global implications that I almost think we've ever seen. This is what Prince William said: "I remain deeply concerned about the terrible human cost of the conflict in the Middle East since the Hamas terrorist attack on October the 7th. Too many have been killed," he said. "I, like so many others, want to see an end to the fighting as soon as possible. There is a desperate need for increased humanitarian support to Gaza. It's critical that aid gets in and that hostages are released. Sometimes it is only when faced with the sheer scale of human suffering that the importance of permanent peace is brought home. Even in the darkest hour, we must not succumb to the counsel of despair. I continue to cling to the hope that a brighter future can be found, and I refuse to give up on that." Well, one good thing, at least he mentioned the hostages, because almost no one these days seems to talk about the Israeli hostages that were taken on October the 7th. But for him to call for an immediate end to all fighting is going to be seen by many in the international community as absolutely clear evidence that Prince William is saying to Israel, stop what you're doing. Some will see that as being given a free pass to Hamas. Many young people will say, hooray, he's doing the right thing. But whether he's doing the right thing or not, has he gone just too far with this? Should our future king intervene in this way? I don't believe that he should. I think he's making a very big mistake. Love to get your thoughts, please. Farage@gbnews.com. Well, I'm joined now by Cameron Walker, our royal correspondent for GB News. And Cameron, I have to say, what has this broke a few hours ago? What has the fallout been so far?
Well, I think it's clearly become very contentious. Many people online and indeed GB News viewers are disagreeing with Prince William, saying he has gone too far and overstepped the mark. Others are praising him and saying that it's important that he's made this intervention fighting for peace. It's an incredibly rare statement. I think it's incredibly bold of Prince William to go quite so far. Yeah. If you remember back to following the October 7th terrorist attack, his spokesperson released a statement where he talked about Israel's right to exercise its right of self-defense. That was not included in the statements released by Prince William today. Of course, in the last few months, it's become more and more polarising, more and more contentious. But I'm getting the sense he really wants to be neutral here. Yes, he calls for an end to the fighting in the Israel-Hamas conflict, but he also wants Hamas to release the terrorists and get critical aid into Gaza. But of course, it's a really fine and tricky line to tread.
Yeah, it is. Of course it is. I mean, look, as I say, I'm pleased that he's mentioned the hostages. They seem to be forgotten by almost everybody these days. But you say he's trying to tread a fine line. Well, why say anything, I suppose, in these circumstances? This is not something that directly affects the British Crown. Indirectly, of course, the implications are enormous. Cameron, this will be interpreted in every way as him telling Israel to stop what they are doing.
Yeah, and I think it's the timing that's really significant here. There's clearly fears that there's going to be an escalation in violence as Israeli forces move into Rafah, the southern city in Gaza. There's an SNP-led Gaza ceasefire motion scheduled in the House of Commons for tomorrow. But clearly, as future king, in a constitutional monarchy, he has to be politically neutral. But then the government comes out this afternoon, Nigel, welcoming Prince William's intervention. A Downing Street spokesperson says his message is consistent with the government's position, and we welcome that information. It's important we speak with a voice, with one voice as a nation. Royal sources tell me the Foreign Office was fully briefed before Prince William made this statement and went to the Red Cross today in London. So I'm getting the sense that the government is using the Prince of Wales as a bit of an asset here, the power of soft diplomacy in action. Whether or not that makes a difference on the ground is another thing, but we'll have to wait and see.
Fair point, Cameron, thank you. And some would argue, of course, the king was used by Rishi Sunak with the so-called Windsor framework. But that's another story. I'm joined now by royal biographer Tom Bower, someone who studies this family, its behaviour and its motives, perhaps in more depth than almost anybody. Tom, I have to say I am astonished by this statement. I think it shows a very serious lapse of judgment, perhaps wanting to follow what the trendy prevailing mood is, but as we know, those moods can change. What say you?
Well, I think he's been very badly advised, and I think it's quite appalling. I see the hand of Lord Cameron in all this, who somehow has shifted into the side of telling Israel to stop, to seek peace. But of course, what Lord Cameron doesn't understand is you can't have peace with Hamas, which is dedicated to the destruction of Israel and the murder of every Jew Israeli that lives in Israel. There is no peace possible with people who are intent on the final solution, Mark II. And so I think it's been a disaster for Prince William to get involved in this. I think that his officials in Kensington Palace should have warned him to stay out of it, because it can only end badly.
Yeah, no, I share that view, but what you just said is very interesting, that you sense the hand of Lord Cameron in all of this. And I just mentioned as an aside the way the King was used over the Windsor Framework Agreements for Northern Ireland. I mean, you are suggesting that the royal family of today is prepared to be, should we say, manipulated by the government and its senior ministers. That is what you're saying.
I'm saying that it probably doesn't want to be manipulated, but he didn't have advisors, that is Prince William, who told him have nothing to do with it. He should have rejected the request by Lord Cameron, whoever it was in the government, to make the speech today, because this is on the eve of tomorrow's debate. We've seen the Labour Party succumb to the pressure of the Muslim vote. Keir Starmer has changed his stance because he fears a revolt in his own party. We're now heading to a very ugly situation in Britain of rampant anti-Semitism, terrible Muslim activities against Jews, and the palace should have stayed out of it, except they might have said that they're disgusted with the anti-Semitism spreading across Britain. But they haven't. They've urged peace. There is no peace with Hamas. It is a terrorist organisation intent on destruction and murder. So what on earth Prince William's advisers thought of adopting Lord Cameron's view and the government's view, it beggars belief where this could end up.
But that's all well and good, Tom, and I've heard this over the years. You know, the Queen or the King or now the Prince of Wales have been poorly advised, but you know, advisors advise. Monarchs and Princes of Wales and ministers, whichever circumstance it is, they're the ones that make the decision, and isn't saying, you know, perhaps you're being diplomatic by saying he's been badly advised. Ultimately, this is down to him, his own judgment, and what he wants the monarchy to be, and that's the thing that I'm calling into question.
Well, I agree with you. Of course, the Queen would never have said anything like this, and I don't even think that Prince Charles, in his most reckless interventions into politics, would have at this very moment, on the eve of the vote tomorrow, on the way the United Nations voted today, would have contributed to this debate. Prince William should have been silent. Nobody needs his contribution on this issue, and by intervening, he has made the whole problem far worse, because he has politicised the whole issue as far as the monarchy is concerned, and he didn't say, which is a great concern to many people in Britain, to stop the anti-Semitic attacks in Britain by, I must say, the Muslims and the far left. And of course the police have contributed terribly to this heightened tension by not stopping the demonstrators speeching all their anti-Semitic, all their racist chants every week in the centre of London. So what on earth is Prince William doing getting involved in this very, very messy, controversial issue?
You've written books, Tom, about our now king. You've written books about Harry. Is this behaviour, from what you know, in keeping with William? Is he somebody who seeks to be politically quite active?
Well, until now, I'd have thought not. That's what's so strange. That is extraordinary. This is a departure from what we expected. And we thought that he was a serious, considered person trying to learn the trade, so to speak. What on earth he wants to get involved in the unbelievable turmoil of the Middle East, and worst of all, the internecine war in the Labour Party, and the terror on the streets of Britain with the anti-Semitism growing daily. I just don't understand. I do honestly think that he has very, very poor advisers who should have said to him, Prince William, Your Highness, you don't know enough about this subject. This isn't where you should step.
Tom Bower, as ever, very, very clear, and thank you. Now, a very senior minister, a very senior official in Border Force has just been sacked within the last hour for telling the truth about how porous our borders are. Should James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, not really have just listened to him rather than simply sacking him, because he's telling us that a huge number of private jets are coming into the UK with nobody being checked at all.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Britain's Newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
When you listen to Nigel Farage's assessment there, do you feel that maybe this is as good as it was going to get, given that we had the pandemic and it was inevitably always going to be a bit of a mixed bag?
Well, I think it's a bit of a poor excuse from Nigel there that they haven't done it properly. The facts are, Nigel, that it's not worked. It's not going to work. Yes, we will rejoin. I mean, are we better off for it? Are they...
Can I jump in there, Charlie? We're going to rejoin under which government? Because Labour aren't going to do that, unless you don't think...
But I mean, it's going to be unavoidable not to join, because I think it's getting worse and worse for us. I mean, let me just say this. Are the NHS better because we're out of Europe? No, they're not, because they're not employing more staff. Is the building trade better off? No. Is travelling abroad or to the EU or staying in the EU, are we better off? No. Are we better off because foods rise because of the EU? No. Are we better off with imports and export? No, because they're taking longer. The overall result is that we're not better off. The killer point here is 57% of the public will now vote to remain. 33% would leave. Surely that's the telling point.
It depends on the pollster, Charlie, because we were talking to a very good pollster earlier who said there's no enthusiasm for any change in a year. Maybe 10 years, they might be thinking about it.
Belinda de Lucia, let's bring you in. I'm sure you want to react to what Charlie said.
I mean, who would have thought that the UK wanting to run its own affairs and making our politicians more accountable would be so revolutionary? EU Parliament voted a majority to get rid of the vetoes, the last remaining scraps of democracy that the EU had. Now, luckily for EU citizens at the moment, you know, it means a treaty change to actually go forward. But that is the mood. The ever closer union. We have dodged a federalised, globalist, international, power-gobbling, anti-democratic organisation, and that's worth more than a few trade and travel perks for a few wealthy people in this country.
Hear, hear. Belinda de Lucia, Charlie Mullins, great to see you both.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, some of your reactions to what Prince William has said. Muriel says Prince William should not make his political viewpoints known to the public. Meghan says agree. William should not have given the pronouncement other than to hope for world peace. And Graham says, I personally think he's done a good job in treading the fine line required. Well, Graham, if all he wanted to do was tread a fine line, why say anything? And I thought what Tom Bower said was very powerful, that it would be quite acceptable for the future monarch to say these terrible anti-Semitic attacks should cease. That would be completely in line with what he's there to do. Ultimately, when he's a bit older, to be a king for everybody. This was a mistake, and it cannot, Graham, I disagree with you. Yes, he did mention the hostages, thank goodness for that. But this is a call on Israel to stop. It's a call on Israel to say, do you know what, Hamas? We're done now. And I don't think that in the long term would do them any good at all. Now, for the second day in a row, the Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, David Neil, is in the news. Yesterday it was the story, if you remember, that 1 in 4 of those who've come to Britain on visas to work in the care sector are working illegally. Today, a story he put out, front page of the Mail, saying that under the terms general aviation, which means private jets, a very large number of jets, many, many hundreds into thousands, come into the country with nobody being checked whatsoever, and that this does pose a potential very serious threat. Neil said, this is a scandal and incredibly dangerous for this country's border security, given that many of those flights that come in come from what are deemed to be high-risk countries. The finger was particularly pointed at London's City Airport. Now for his trouble, he has been sacked. Now it's fair to say he was due to go in a month's time. He could have reapplied for the job, but James Cleverly has sacked him because he's broken the normal terms of his contract. But I have to say, Mr. Cleverly, rather than sacking Mr. Neil, maybe what you should be doing is listening to the fact that the independent chief inspector of our borders has now for 2 days in a row told us that things are not working, that the whole thing is a farce bordering on disgrace, and we're told he's got many, many more documents to reveal. So what do we make of all of this? Well, I think it's a bit of a disaster. I'm joined by Matthew Finn, Chief Executive of Augment IQ. And your business, Matthew, is to see that we can move around the world as freely as we reasonably can whilst maintaining a degree of security, all of which makes sense. What do you make of what David Neil told the Daily Mail and the story they put on their front page? Does it ring true to you? Because Tom Pursglove, the illegal immigration minister, says, no, these flights are being checked. What's your experience of this?
Well, it does ring true, Nigel. And I think what's interesting in this story is the timing of it. Those of us that have been working in border security for some time will recognise this as something we've heard before. This is not particularly new. General aviation has always been seen as perhaps one of the more vulnerable points in the international travel segment. Commercial aviation, international high-speed rail, cruise lines, ferries, etc., they're much more robust. Back in the early 2000s, the government of the day was trying to put in place a program to address some of the border security concerns that they had 15, 16 years ago, and general aviation was one of those concerns then. So I think the timing of it is interesting. Okay. The vulnerability has existed for some time. This is not particularly new.
Just explain to our audience what general aviation looks like.
So most of the audience, myself included, will be very familiar with commercial aviation, getting on board a plane, flying out from London City Airport, Gatwick, etc. And we do that on a regular basis for leisure or for business. General aviation are the much smaller aircraft, essentially private charters or private jets that come in and out of the country with very few people on board. And what we're seeing here in what David Neil has revealed is a different approach to border security for those flights. So we must ask the question, on what basis do we determine risk in the security field, particularly when it comes to the UK border? Why are we viewing certain private jets, general aviation coming into the UK as lower or higher risk, and why are we not screening them accordingly?
But if I fly on a private aeroplane, a private jet from America or Europe into the UK, it is the duty, is it not, of that pilot and perhaps co-pilot to report to the United Kingdom who is on board that plane. As I understand it, that has to be done. So presumably, if names are being submitted, and if, for example, at City Airport, those that land by private jet are made to walk through the passport hall along with everybody else. I mean, surely this can be resolved very easily.
It can certainly be resolved. There are different techniques to doing it, and you're right to highlight that the operator of that private aircraft would normally be providing a general aviation report, which would include the full manifest of all passengers and crew on board. And that manifest would include your name, date of birth, gender, passport number, etc. Where there becomes an issue is the integrity of that data. Do we trust it? Was it just written up, or did they actually check the validity of the document? Is it a genuine document that they were copying the names and numbers from?
Yep.
That's one question we should ask ourselves. Was the person who presented it actually the person to whom it was issued? Were they the genuine holder of that document? And more specifically, how long does Border Force or any of the security services have in terms of time to effect some kind of mitigation or response if they believe that someone on board that aircraft is deemed of higher risk? How would they go about doing that if they're just receiving an Excel spreadsheet, perhaps poorly formatted, only 2 hours before that flight departs?
But I just say, I find this whole thing really, Matthew, quite incredible, because these are not flights landing at some obscure little airfield where there might not be permanent Border Force staff. We're talking here about City Airport, which carries a huge number of passengers every single year. You know, they will have staffing, they will have Border Force staffing there. So surely, all you need to do is make the private jets walk through the same room. this can be resolved, and I want to know why it hasn't been.
I think you're right to highlight that. Obviously, general aviation applies to many airfields around the country, some of which do not have that kind of infrastructure. But for the specific example of London City Airport, you're right to highlight that there is the time and the opportunity for passengers arriving from whichever destination on a private aircraft to proceed through some form of border control under the supervision of the Home Office. Now, that could be an e-gate, and we've seen many of those around most of the airports in the UK, and that would determine that the document was genuine, that the passport holder was the right person, and it would be able to wash that against the warnings index in the UK to determine if that person was a good or a bad person based on previous understandings of their risk. So it does beg the question, when we look at the specific example of London City Airport, why is the arrivals process different if you're arriving on a different type of aircraft?
Absolutely. Matthew Finn, thank you for joining us and giving your level of expertise, and Matthew for directly contradicting Tom Pursglove, the illegal immigration minister. And this just goes on and on, doesn't it? The government reassuring us all is well, nothing to worry about, and it is frankly a farce. Well, today a big NFU, National Farmers Union conference, and for the first time since 2008, a British Prime Minister has gone along to speak to the nation's farmers. And he's done it, of course, because of the growing protests in Kent and Wales and who knows where else. In a moment, we'll tell you what Rishi had to say.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
The Camilla Tominey Show, Sunday mornings from 9:30.
Questions to be answered, and there seem to be a significant amount, does once again point its way to a public inquiry into exactly what happened in this case. Starmer's called for that. Would you call for that too?
I certainly think that first of all, there's one thing that's happening now. The NHS have to order an independent inquiry. That's been done. So they've got to look at all the whys and wherefores of what happened with this man. If it appears that we're not getting sufficient depth and breadth to this, then I think having an inquiry with all the powers that brings would be extremely advantageous. What I don't want is some long-winded inquiry that will take years, by which time other people will have been put at risk and maybe other lives have lost. We know what the problems are here, Camilla. Law's been passed on this. This is all about making sure on the ground we implement the highest degree of monitoring in order to ensure the safety of the public.
Has care in the community failed? I mean, it seems oxymoronic to say that it's care in the community in this case. We know that the number of psychiatric care beds has been slashed from 52,000 back in 2001 to 24,000 now. I've anecdotally, because I wrote my column about this in the Telegraph yesterday, received quite a lot of correspondence from people saying the situation with care in the community is dire. People aren't being adequately monitored. Was it a mistake to close down all of those mental institutions?
I don't think we should go back to those days when we had those appalling institutions where we just lock people away and forget about them, and not just mental health people, but autistic people and disabled people. Horrific way to treat individuals, and you know I campaign on that a lot.
I know.
However, I think if we move into a more community-based approach, which can be really good for many, many people who are on the spectrum and on that scale of mental health, we have to remember there will be a small but significant number who will continue to pose a danger.
Okay.
And that's why monitoring is so important.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
For nearly half a century, British farming wasn't run by elected British politicians. Good Lord, no. Now, that was all done in Brussels under the Common Agricultural Policy. Well, now we've left the European Union, we're in charge of our own agricultural policy, much more indeed than we are in terms of its cousin fisheries. And that is in a way why you're seeing protests, because what they're doing in Dover and what they've been doing in Wales this week, they can have a direct effect on people who are making the laws and the rules by which farming is being governed. Now today, there's a big National Farmers Union conference taking place after a week of these protests, taking place in Birmingham. And for the first time since 2008, a Prime Minister has gone along to this conference. That's how worried he is, not just about the protests, but about the polling that was out last week, saying that of the 100 most rural seats, of which the Conservatives currently hold 96, they could lose up to 50 of them to the Labour Party. That is why Rishi Sunak was there. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
Unlike the Labour Party, we will never introduce mandatory requirements to put a percentage of your land into schemes. Nor will we introduce broad-ranging blanket rules like top-down 20-mile-an-hour mandates. With us, you'll have more choice, not less. You can trust us, because I know how important my neighbours, our farmers, all of you truly are. You help support millions of jobs, add billions to our economy, shape the landscape, but most of all, you produce the food we need. Food that is some of the best and highest quality anywhere in the world. And that's why I say to all of you and to Britain's farmers, just as I did in my very first speech in Parliament, I've got your back.
Classic Rishi Sunak. Tell the audience what they want to hear. Tell the audience we're on your side, we're Conservatives, and forget about the track record. Well, let's have a start, shall we? We would never tell you how you should manage your land. Good Lord, no. Let's go back 2 years to the Conservative Party conference and Boris Johnson.
We are going to rewild parts of the country and consecrate a total of 30% to nature. We're planting tens of millions of trees. Otters are returning to rivers from which they have been absent for decades. Beavers that have not been seen on some rivers since Tudor times, massacred for their pelts and now back. And if that isn't conservatism, my friends, I don't know what is. Build back beaver, I say.
Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. There he was saying he wanted to rewild 30% of the farmland in the country. Build back beaver, God help us. And, of course, says Rishi, we would never as Conservatives, no, never, impose 20-mile-per-hour blanket measures inside built-up areas. Really? Really? Are you telling the truth, Prime Minister? Have you forgotten about Cornwall? Yes, the unitary authority in Cornwall, Conservative run, have just introduced in the last few months 20-mile-an-hour limit zones across the entire county. Folks, I don't believe a blooming word this bloke says. It's all spin. It's all telling people what he thinks they want to hear. But I wonder how it's gone down with the National Farmers Union, and I'm joined now by Jack Carson, GB News' reporter. Jack, as you can see, he's doing his best to come along and talk to an audience. And yes, subsidy now does come from the British government, not from Brussels. Has he convinced them?
Well, really interesting topic, of course, Nigel. Of course, he made some big commitments in the room today, didn't he, in terms of new grant funding, in terms of trying to meet food security, which is particularly a big issue for many of the farmers here at the National Farmers Union Conference. Making those commitments in the room today, trying to get people on side. A lot of the farmers I've spoken to, of course, they realise he wants their votes, doesn't he? He's looking for, of course, their support as we head into the inevitable general election over the next 12 months. But let's get some more analysis, shall we, of how exactly that speech went down today with Andrew Meredith, who's the editor of Farmers Weekly. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. How do you feel Sunak's speech went down today with farmers in the room?
I think what most people were saying to me is that he basically met minimum expectations. He came with something to say, he had some commitments to make. He tried to emote and show that he understood what farmers were going through. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of farmers out there that are feeling like their livelihoods are under threat, and I'm not sure that he assuaged those concerns.
Of course, he did make some big funding commitments. There was some opposition in the room that this is just old money, rebranded, rehashed into something new. So what more does he need to commit to get these people on side?
Look, in England, you have that 2.4 billion, which has been a manifesto commitment since 2019 to spend on farming and the environment. So there is no money beyond that being committed today. That is just new ways to spend that same budget. So if Rishi had really wanted to make an impact today, he could have committed that in the manifesto he would, as nearly every farming and environmental lobby group are asking, he could have committed to increasing that budget. Some are asking for 4 billion, some are asking for more. And look, farmers understand as well as anybody that everybody's asking for more right now. But the cost of the green transition is going to be enormous, and it is not credible at 2.4 billion that they are going to have enough spending power to meet their targets, I don't think.
Of course, we've been seeing the protests, haven't we, on the continent, in France, in Germany, we're all recently today in Poland and Greece. We've already seen them at the port of Dover. How concerned are you? Are you concerned do you think that these are going to develop into something more serious here in the UK?
I think you've got to think about farming policy now in devolved terms, because every nation is different. It's a devolved issue, food and farming policy. So I would say the Welsh are the most angry and most upset with the direction their government is going in. So there's more likely to be tractors on the streets of Cardiff than there is on London. But across the UK, I don't think there has been a time in a long time where farmers have felt so uncertain about their future. I think farmers like my friends Nick and Caris Grayson, tenant farmers, they are asking themselves whether they will have a business to hand on to their boys in the way that they inherited a business from Nick's family. And they are just symptomatic of farmers right across the UK right now.
Yeah, and what you mentioned there is of course, this Welsh sustainable farming scheme. That is, of course, the way of giving up land, essentially, for more sustainable projects. And with Wales, it is minimum entry requirements. But to be able to get that funding, it's minimum requirements of giving up land for those projects. And that's where the anger comes from. In fact, Minette Batters today, in her speech, said that there could be up to 5,500 job losses, hundreds of millions of pounds lost from farming in Wales if this scheme was to go ahead.
That's exactly right, and farmers in Wales are more reliant on government funding on average than farmers in England, and yet the government in Wales seems to be pursuing a higher threshold in future for farmers to meet the criteria whereby they are eligible for those funds. So farmers there are very cross. They say they are the cornerstone of the rural economy. If they are going to crumble, then all of the farming and rural goods and services, the businesses that surround them, they will crumble too. So this is an attack not just on farmers, but on the rural economy. And the farming unions there and the protesters there, those nascent protest organisations, they really want to see a relaxation on that commitment, that requirement in the consultation at the moment for farmers to have 10% of their land in trees and 10% of their land in habitat. Environmentalists say, of course, that if the government is going to spend money, then they need to see a return for it. So there is a real live debate happening at the moment about how that money should be spent.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us this evening to give us some of that rundown of what has gone on, of course, here in Birmingham at the National Farmers Union conference. Pretty much, I'd say, Nigel, to sum up, the jury's still out very much on who these farmers trust more, of course, to bring back British farming heading towards that general election.
Jack Carson, thank you very much indeed. And I have to say, I thought Andrew Meredith there from Farmers Weekly was, how can I put it, underwhelmed by the Prime Minister's performance today. Hey, he's got real problems. Now, the What the Farage moment. You may remember back on the 4th of January, we sent Adam Cherry from GB News down to Hampshire, to Farnborough in Hampshire, where some really rather nice new apartments had been built. They looked really beautiful. The thought was they'd be up for private rental, but no. The Home Office, or one of the companies they use, had intervened, and these were going to be used for migrant accommodation. And we kicked up a bit of a stink, and we did our best to talk to Leo Doherty, the local Conservative Member of Parliament, who point blank refused to speak to us, but we did quite a lot of work on it. And the Home Office then said no, migrants would not be moving in there. They announced that just a few days later. Well, over the course of the last week, there have been some considerable activity around these flats. People have spotted duvets, pillows, furniture, other items being moved into the apartments. So we've got it on, video footage. You can look at it and see it right now. And of course, we've been back to the Home Office to ask them, what is going on here? And the response we've got is the Home Office continually reviews the appropriateness of different sites for use as asylum accommodation. We have always been upfront about the unprecedented pressure. Oh, there's no point reading the rest of it out, really, is there? I mean, you know what's going to happen. You know that actually those that have crossed the channel are going to get put into these flats, and that's it, because they're now pledged to reduce the numbers staying in hotels. So they'll be going into, in this case, brand spanking new apartments. As for Leo Doherty, the local MP, who you would have thought would be very grateful to GB News for shining a light on this issue, he still absolutely point blank refuses to speak to us. It's funny, isn't it, just how low grade some of our members of Parliament seem to have become. Not, of course, that comment applies directly, you understand, to Mr. Doherty. Now, in a moment, a story that really did surprise me. Some video footage emerging from Oldham of a young 8-year-old white British kid converting to become a Muslim, praising Allah. But apparently this is going on quite a considerable scale across the country. What on earth is going on? We'll have a look at it just after the break.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Weekdays from midday.
Elon Musk has announced that the first patients to receive a groundbreaking brain implant from Neuralink is recovering well.
This is all a bit odd. The product, called Telepathy, uses a robot to surgically place a computer chip in a region of the brain that controls movement.
Yes, Elon Musk says that the first goal is to enable people to control a phone or a computer just by thinking. He says that initial tests show promising signs of brain activity, meaning that patients with paralysis could one day overcome their conditions.
Not sure about this one. Joining us to discuss this breakthrough is applied futurist Tom Cheesewright. Tom, this sounds, slightly terrifying.
I certainly think a lot of people will be thinking this is something out of a sci-fi horror rather than reality. But this is a technology that's been a long time coming. We've been developing direct brain-computer interfaces for a long time, mostly for the sort of therapeutic reasons that are the initial goal, at least, of Elon Musk's Neuralink, to allow people who are perhaps quadriplegic to have direct control via their brains of initially a smartphone and maybe ultimately artificial limbs or a wheelchair.
It does seem fascinating how quickly this technology is moving on. I saw demonstrations perhaps a year or two ago of people playing a very simple Pong game just by thinking, moving sort of one line on a screen up and down. This seems like potentially there has been a breakthrough that means far more complex things can be controlled just by thinking.
Well, there's lots of different aspects to this technology. The initial attempts to interface with the brain used actually quite thick prongs almost that went into the brain, and they were quite solid, and so if the brain moved, they could potentially cause damage.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's Live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's Live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
So the piece of footage you're about to see on your screens came to my attention this morning and did ever so slightly surprised me. And it's a scene from Oldham, and it's a young boy under 10 years old who is converting to Islam. And it finished up with, "You're a Muslim, Rudy," cheers the man as he hugs the child, whose hand he has held throughout a short ceremony at a Lancashire mosque. And then the young kid says, "Nothing worthy of worship but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." Now, I was slightly surprised that a young white kid did this, but this particular priest is claiming that in the area of Lancashire, up to 30,000 people have converted over the last period of time to become Muslims. Now, I can't verify any of those numbers, but it does appear that it is happening on a scale. Nothing suggests lots of those converting are youngsters like this boy, but something out there is going on, as indeed we know in our prisons. We've seen many, many people converting to Islam. So I wonder, what's the appeal? Or is there somehow pressure being put on? Certainly in prisons, it's quite easy to see, given that the Church of England and others have given up providing any spiritual leadership whatsoever. Maybe Islam does fill something of a vacuum. But is there something bigger and wider going on within society? Is it all free choice? Or could there be elements, perhaps, of peer pressure or intimidation pushing people in this direction? And I wonder, given that everybody, including Prince William, now seems to be saying that the Israelis are bad guys, whether there is potential for this to increase. Well, I'm joined down the line from the Netherlands by Charlotte Littlewood, Head of Research at the International Centre for Sustainability. Charlotte, I was a little bit surprised to read all of that stuff today and to see that this is going on, perhaps on a considerable scale. Difficult for us to actually measure it, but I just wonder initially what your thoughts are on that as a big picture.
Well, first of all, I wouldn't be so surprised. I think in an increasingly globalized world where we have so much access to information at all times, often that feeling very negative, people do feel lost. They do search for something that gives them structure and meaning. And Islam, as well as Christianity, can be a very strong source of that for people. So I think conversions are absolutely predictable. I don't think there's anything wrong with young people converting to Islam at all, quite the opposite. But I do have concerns about some of the key converters, if you will, that have come out that they've converted 30,000 plus. And these have been the likes of Shakil Beg. And then, as you've just said, the discussions around prisons, the radicalization in prisons, I would call it, not conversion. And I think you have to separate that religious conversion into a faith and radicalization into Islamist extremism, two different things that are happening.
So in a sense, what you're saying, Charlotte, is that, Islam provides a certain degree of belief, a certain degree of conviction, a certain degree of surety, perhaps in a world where, in this country anyway, under Archbishop Welby, the Church of England is now completely failing to give out any of those strong, positive messages. And I fully understand and take on board that point. But is there evidence? And I'm just speculating. By the way, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with people converting to Islam. I'm just asking why and how. Is there perhaps evidence? If, for example, you were a young white kid in a school that was overwhelmingly Muslim, there may well be considerable peer pressure to do this as well.
I think we know that that's the case in prisons. Again, if we bring back to that case study where there is gang pressure to convert and you get protected if you're then a part of Islam. I'm not sure about the school setting. Where I would be concerned is the likes of Shakil Beg, who has said that he has converted 30,000, and he lost his case against the BBC for being called an extremist. In 2006, he talked about Palestine being a legitimate place for jihad. Again, he talked about removing Zionists from Israel in 2008, and year on and year on. And he has celebrated key Islamist ideologues, founders of the Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat-e-Islami. And he's basically your poster buoy of Islamist radicalism here in the UK. So I would be very concerned about directions into Islam via the likes of Shakil Beg. There we have an issue. That's where I would say we have a real homegrown radicalization issue. But conversions more generally, it does speak to, I think, a retreating church if we're seeing more into Islam than Christianity. Again, there's no problem with that. But there is a problem if we're talking about radicalization, not conversion.
No. Do you feel, Charlotte, and it's a huge question but needs an hour's debate, not a 1 minute answer, but do you feel ultimately that in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time that the Muslim faith is going to sit comfortably in most of our country alongside the Christian faith?
You mean sit comfortably alongside in size and numbers, or comfortably alongside without conflict?
Without conflict.
Not if we continue to allow for extremism to manifest in this country. There is opportunities for liberal Islam. There is always opportunities for reform. There are key reformists working in the UK, and there is moderate Islam, not just liberal Islam. There's moderate Islam. But what we have done and we continue to do is allow for an extremist section of Islam to dictate what Islam is, to take positions of authority, organizations of authority and influence even within Parliament. And that's where we have a real problem of failing, and we've continued to fail in that regard.
I'm afraid that's right. Charlotte Littlewood, thank you very much indeed for joining me again on this programme on GB News. And indeed, Suella Braverman in the last couple of days has come out and spoken very openly, saying, look, we're actually, we are allowing extremism and extremist language on our streets. And it would appear the subtext of what she's saying is the police do precious little about it. It is going to be very difficult in years to come to see how this goes on without there being very serious conflict. And already it is rocking British electoral politics. It is absolutely shaking the Labour Party to its core, as we witness, for the first time ever in our lives, in England certainly, sectarianism. Genuine sectarianism in our politics. Maybe there were little pockets of it in Liverpool and elsewhere in the past, I don't know. But I've never seen it the way that it is, and the speed with which it seems to have spread throughout our system. Now, as you may see from the background, I'm in Washington, D.C. today. I'm going to be in America for the rest of the week, and we're going to introduce from tomorrow rather more American themes. But for now, I wonder, what does Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg have for you in a few minutes' time?
Well, thank you very much, and I hope you're enjoying the United States. I'm going to be talking about the attack on private property that's going on in this country with the Renters Reform Bill and with the rule that you're going to have to get planning permission to let your house out or flat out on Airbnb.
Yeah. No, very good subjects, Jacob, to cover, because if we believe in freedom and property rights and all of those things, and all of which makes me scratch my head, that it is a so-called conservative government that has done all of these things, but no doubt Jacob will cover all of that with you in a few moments' time. I'm back with you tomorrow live from here in Washington at 7, but for now, let's get the weather.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, very good evening to you. I'm Alex Berkhill and here's your latest GB News weather forecast. It is going to be widely very wet for most of us tomorrow morning. However, before then, we still have some rain around this evening and overnight, particularly across parts of the south as a front has made its way southwards as we've gone through today and is going to linger across southern parts through the night, bringing cloudy, wet weather here. Clearer skies further north at least to start the night before some cloudy, wet and windy conditions feed up from the southwest. Like I said, some clear skies to start the night in the north, and so we could see a touch of frost for a time before the unsettled weather pushes its way in, lifting our temperatures. So most places will start tomorrow mild but wet. Watch out for some heavy rain, could cause some spray on the roads, and we're likely to see a bit of flooding and some travel disruption, especially in parts of the southwest. However, the rain will clear away towards the east as we go through the day, with something drier and brighter following in behind, just a few showers to watch out for here and there. It is going to be windy though, and so that wind will take the edge off the temperatures, which are above average for the time of year. More unsettled weather to come through the end of the week, likely to see another band of rain sweeping its way through on Thursday, and that could be quite heavy, some downpours possible with showers likely elsewhere, and more showers to come as we go through Friday. It's likely to be a bit blustery at times too, but there should be some sunshine in between into Saturday, and it looks a little bit drier, but temperatures dropping closer to average for the time of year.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Lee Anderson's Real World, Fridays from 7 p.m.
Dr. Jane Jones, who's the clinical lead for Care After Combat.
Yep.
Jane, thanks for coming. And just tell me a little bit about your organisation. What do you do?
OK, well, thank you for having me here so we can talk about Care After Combat. So we are an organisation, a charity, who work into the prison system, working with military veterans who've somehow got involved with the justice system. And
so there's quite a high population of ex-service men and women in our prisons. Why is that, do you think?
So 2014, the government did a review